Good evening or good night in Ireland, everyone, to welcome to the American Irish Historical Society and the Irish American Heritage Museum. We're delighted to have with us Cork historian and author Michelle O'Mahony to talk to us as part of our Great Hunger lecture series, which is complementing the sculpture exhibition that we have on loan to us here from Quinnipiac and Ireland's Great Hunger Museum of Fairfield, Connecticut. Michelle has written several case studies on workhouses, not just in famine, but also contributed to that massive book. It's fantastic, The Atlas of the Great Irish Famine. It's like an encyclopedia. It's really brilliant. She has also does research work as a bespoke historian consultant, so you should check out her website. But she's going to talk to us tonight about one of the kind of more poignant, I suppose, and sad elements of the Great Hunger, although, as she just was telling me when we were off camera, one of the least understood parts too. Naturally, the Great Hunger, was a terrible time for the poorest of the poor at home in Ireland, and the workhouses was this kind of very negatively interpreted and remembered aspect of this, where families were separated. And so tonight she's going to talk to us about the lives of the innocents of the workhouse, the children in them. So thank you so much, Michelle, for coming, and welcome. Of course, Cork and Kerry are near neighbours and bitter rivals, but we won't mention any of that. And I'm delighted to have you join us. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much for the introduction there. Cork and Kerry, yes, we are rivals, but for some of your audience there, you might be aware that I'm beaming in tonight from Dunmanway, which is the hometown of Sam Maguire. So we don't mind sharing the trophy now and again with Kerry and the other counties. We have Sam the man here in Dunmanway. So from Dunmanway, I would like to say, Diogwyd, Tom an rodúil as a bheith anseo tránóna inniuh chun labhairt faoin Gorta Mór agus na leanaí a bhí isteach san teach bocht, and I promise that will be the last piece of Irish you'll hear tonight, so your audience won't have to be trying to do Google Translate with me. But thank you so much for having me here tonight and for joining with me as part of your lecture series. I suppose Ireland and America, we have that shared history, we have that shared connection. And one of my mottos on my website and my business is unlocking the past. And for me to be able to deliver a talk to you all about the innocent children is sort of unlocking their lives for you and bringing it to you in a relatable way. Everything from their little existence inside in the workhouse, their diet, how they slept, even their education, the diseases that they encountered, and their lives afterwards towards the latter years of the workhouse. I also know that I suppose our shared histories are very relevant today. And I would like to thank the American Irish Society for its work that it does, continuing its motto that the world may know and it may know our shared heritage. So this evening I'm going to bring you on that journey, highlighting the plight of these innocent children, their experiences inside the institution, or to give them their correct name, the children were known as inmates. Everybody who entered the workhouse was given the term inmate. It's almost akin to a sort of a prison system. So as we go through the talk, if you sort of try and equate a workhouse institution to a sort of penal institution, you'll get a better grasp of things, I think. So as you said, I've done many books on the famine. I've done many articles, I've done a number of presentations, but I do find this chapter in my own book on children, maybe it's because I was an English and history teacher in a previous decade, that I like speaking about the plight of the children. So we'll focus on the children. So I'm just going to start this slideshow and hopefully so this is the Cork Union Minute Book. And it's one of the original minute books. It's a primary source book, and it's one of the main treatises from where I got all my information relating to the workhouse. You would have had workhouse registers, lists of the inmates, but all the books relating to the workhouses in Ireland generally had this particular embossing scheme. It was standard issue, standard stationery for each of the workhouses. And I suppose it gives a good idea, really, of the bureaucracy that surrounds these institutions. Workhouse books that you can read on the workhouses that tell you the story of the workhouses. There's not that many that give you a huge amount of detail on workhouses during the famine years. I suppose, and a book that I would recommend to people who are interested in the workhouse system would be John O'Connor's book on the workhouses, if you can get your hands on it. Sometimes it's out of print. And then my own book is a deep dive into life in Cork Union Workhouse and its impact, a little bit pre-famine, a little bit post-famine, but mainly a huge statistical analysis that wasn't done before 2005, and really hasn't been done since. And the atlas, as you said, of the Great Famine, that really maps quite a lot of detail and brings a lot of us contributors together. But as regards Cork Union Workhouse, you can really take it as being a representation of workhouses in general throughout Ireland. It'll give you an idea. The same thing happened in each one, more or less. The same level of bureaucracy, the same level of governance. All that was really different was that they were designed to house a different capacity. So Cork Workhouse was designed to hold 2,000 inmates. The workhouse here in Dunmanway was designed to take 400 inmates, and most workhouses doubled, if not trebled, capacity in the middle years of the famine around 1847 to 1848-49. So that just gives you a little bit of a quick introduction into the Cork Union House. So the next slide here really tells you a little bit about how County Cork was divided into a number of unions. So we had 11 poor law unions when the poor law was established in County Cork. This was pre-1850. By 1850 and the latter years of the famine, we had increased almost 50% to up to 18 unions. So this was really in response to the Great Hunger, the famine on Gortumur. They had to extend the poor law system during those years. So there was almost a 50% increase from 1840s to about 1851. So just to familiarise yourself, this is me a number of years ago at Cork Union Workhouse, and this will give you an idea of what life was like. What was the first, I suppose, presentation to a child, to a regular inmate as they went to seek admission to a workhouse. So you were admitted through these doors, the door that you can see here. This is the administration block of the Cork Union Workhouse. It is today part of St. Finbarr's Hospital, which is a large medical complex. It houses many departments, and a lot of the buildings of Cork Union Workhouse have been repurposed since. And practically, if you travel around Ireland, a lot of the other county hospitals tend to be on the site of workhouses, whether they're ruined workhouses or whether they've been repurposed. I suppose you could say that a lot of the early health system in Ireland was founded on these complexes. And just one thing to note is that one of the first acts of the first Dáil in 1919 was to get rid of the term workhouse. And they became known as county homes for the elderly, cottage hospitals, or town hospitals, really. So the term workhouse existed really up until 1919 to one of the first acts of the first Dáil. So looking at this picture, if you arrived and you were a little child, it just gives you an idea of what they faced. You can see there's a stairs left and right, and the balcony area is where the Board of Guardians would have had their meeting and every Saturday, and where they would look out to the front to see who was seeking admission. And then there was another room at the back that went into a courtyard area, and you were admitted here. The master of the workhouse took care of the male inmates generally. The matron took care of the female, and each of those had a office on either side of that balcony. And then you would have clerical officers and support staff on the ground floor, where these registers and those stationery books that I showed in an earlier slide at the beginning, where you would actually see, have your details taken. And then once you were seen to, your details taken, you progressed obviously through the system, then through the doors into the next section where you were met with the matron, who would then take the girls to the girls' wards, and the boys then were taken by the master and his clerical officer to their wards. And I suppose some of the people here today may not be aware of, the workhouse system, how it was set up, and a lot of people some people have a preconceived notion that the workhouses were something that happened as a response to the Great Hunger and as a response to the famine. But there was a tradition in Ireland surrounding workhouses that went back much further. So the workhouses were set up under the Poor Law Ireland Act of 1838, and they decided they would set up a system of workhouses. Now, almshouses, houses of industry, poorhouses were all names associated with workhouses, but these were the earlier ones. They were not a new concept. Often, charitable organisations and religious groups provided charity and provided relief. Historical evidence also shows us that going back over 1,000 years, even to monastic times, there was almshouses. But the Irish famine generated this greater awareness of feared institutions where people would have to go just to eke out a basic existence. And the system was never designed or intended to deal with a famine or with the Great Hunger or with the Gort to Moor. The salient role of the Poor Law was designed to deter vagrancy. It was designed to deter what would be idleness, homelessness, where people would become self-reliant on themselves, and you would not have, I suppose, people on the sides hungry, and that they would learn to look after themselves. And one of the quotes from a commentator at the time was that the Poor Law was designed to guarantee the indigent Irishman he would be free from starvation, because the deterrent was so great that people would never allow themselves to be in a position whereby they would actually need to enter a workhouse. So it was a system of deterrence. In 1836, Sir George Nichols travelled Ireland, and Nichols decided that he would like to investigate, could the Poor Law system, which was in operation in England and Wales, be adopted into Ireland, that particular system. So in November 1838, four commissioners landed in Dublin to map the country and divide it into 130 unions. Each of these unions, really, the easiest way to describe them is they're like a collection of parishes, but not quite parishes, put together around a central, more or less, market town. And then the workhouses would be built from a poor rate levied on the landlords and people, the landowners in Ireland, and also with the new provincial banks as well. They provided loans to the local unions. And it was designed to provide indoor and outdoor relief. So indoor relief was when you actually went in and sought admission to the workhouse on a permanent basis. Outdoor relief, sometimes various workhouses would agree to give outdoor relief, such as bread and later on soup and things like that during the hunger years. And also the Poor Law provided for assisted passage and immigration, which we'll come to later, for orphan girls and orphan children and people who wanted to leave Ireland as well. But this largely was a way of freeing up beds and spaces, when you could move people on who had nowhere else to go. So some of you may be familiar with this quote. I use it in my book. It was by Thomas Noel, written about 1846, talking about a funeral cortege and the rattling of bones over the cobblestones. But the two words that to me stand out for the famine would be my bones, the children's bones, that they were all skeletal, and I'm a poor pauper that nobody owns. And I suppose that phrase, a poor pauper that nobody owns, is particularly important for all paupers, but especially for the children. Children that entered the workhouse were on their own sometimes. They were segregated, they were taken away from their family, and they became paupers. They may never again have met their family, and to them it felt that nobody owned them. They were all put together in various dormitories depending on their ages. Pauperism was something as well that I suppose, the Poor Law in both Britain and Ireland sought to have a policy of deterrence on. They didn't like pauperism, but I would say that when you compare the Poor Law of England and Wales to the Poor Law in Ireland, the system in England, the quality of life that a pauper was given in England was far better than the Irish pauper at the time. Um, and that was because the poor law and the workhouse buildings had an added financial constraint that we'll look at now. So this is an example from the Architectural Institute of Ireland where they have some planning and drawings of the workhouses. So from first glance, when you look at a workhouse, um, it looks like a H block presentation, very much like a penal institution, like a prison. And at the beginning of my talk, I mentioned just bear that in mind. So George Wilkinson was the architect who was tasked with making sure that the workhouses from the English poor law were adapted into the Irish poor law system. But he was given one remit, and it was a constraint that meant all workhouses in Ireland had to be produced only at two-thirds the cost of the English workhouse, which meant that a lot of the workhouses in Ireland were left unfinished and unplastered and were a lot colder than their English counterparts. But it also meant that items such as diet, the bureaucracy, finance was also one-third less. So even the diet, when we compare the diets later on in the talk of children in the English poor law system and the Irish poor law system, whether or not we had the added um, trouble and problems when the Irish hunger started and the Great Hunger started, before we ever got to that stage, the Irish pauper and his diet was still in a worse position than the British pauper. So these buildings were cold, unplastered, whitewashed in a H block configuration, and we had various departments there. So you had dormitories where the people were segregated into male and female. Children were divided into children under 2 years of age, children between 2 and 12, children between 12 and 15. So different age cohorts were together. The different sexes were isolated. And then they only really came together when they met in the chapel for worship. And the chapel often doubled up as a dining room. And in most workhouses, the horizontal part that you can see here on this map of the workhouse in the H, the line going across, that usually tends to be the chapel or the dining room in most workhouses in Ireland and in England. And that the entrance block, you can see where the words are ground plan. That would be that entrance block that I showed you at the start as well. Most workhouses would have that entrance block. And luckily enough, quite a few of them still survive in Ireland, and you can actually see that austere nature of them. Now, obviously, they've been turned into health complexes since, but you can still see that austerity that's there in them. One thing that's not mentioned on the map is that most of them would also have had a black hole, which was a place of solitary confinement, where inmates who transgressed house rules were actually put for a period of solitary confinement for something as simple as smuggling tobacco in or not changing the straw on their bedding. Just very, very minor issues caused them to be placed in the black hole, and the black hole was about 6 foot by 6 foot square. Um, so that brings that whole notion of penal servitude into being again. Um, Various historians have commented, as their descriptions of the workhouse institution, they're calling them feared institutions. They call them chamber of horrors. They call them grim bastilles of despair. And they were there primarily designed to prevent and deter vagrancy and idleness. So what happened then when the Blight arrived in 1845? What did it do to the workhouses and the position of children? So just to recap, the workhouses were not designed specifically for the Irish Great Famine, for An Gorta Mór. They were there as part of the poor law. So the role of the Board of Guardians and the master and the matron and the people that administrated each union, they were at a loss as well as to how to deal with this situation when it came about. So at no point were the workhouses designed for a large-scale humanitarian disaster, but effectively that's what they had to deal with over the course of 5 to 7 years from 1845 to 1852. The Guardians, however, considered themselves to be, I suppose, the guardians of morals, really, and warriors on a great sort of administrative crusade to make sure they made um, all the financial constraints that they were given to make sure that they were met for the guardians and for their superiors, the commissioners. And they also believed that by deterring vagrancy, they were enhancing the moral tone of the whole community and all of Ireland at the same time. So I suppose the next one then is when the little children and people arrived, what happened to them? So you had to fulfill the destitute rule before you could even be admitted to a workhouse. And the destitute rule really stated that you had to be at the lowest level of subsistence um, before you'd ever even get admitted to a workhouse. So you had to be very, very low on the scale of pauperism, believe it or not. And not everybody was allowed in. You had to prove that you had nowhere to go and you were really at the very, very the end almost. Subsistence that they gave you to exist was minimal. It was like nutrition of no consequence whatsoever. And there is cases when I do argue in my book where possibly admission to a workhouse probably did some people and some victims of the Great Hunger absolutely no advantage whatsoever. They may have been better off outside because with the level of disease and overcrowding, um, the risk factor that they encountered was horrendous. So once they fulfilled the destitute rule, the clerical officer, as I had said earlier, took their details. He was in that initial block that they entered, and then they were escorted then by the master or matron to the relevant dormitories. The children, they were given a copy of the rule book, and they were instructed what would happen to them if they transgressed any house rules. They were known as house rules, and everybody was given a uniform, a workhouse uniform. And then something similar to what we see, I suppose within Ellis Island and other places where we have immigrants coming en masse. They were at the time in the 19th century, they were all deloused, cleaned, various hygiene practices, segregated into appropriate wards. No communication was allowed between any of the groups. So if a mother went in with a number of children, she may not see any of her children again unless they were under the age of 2. Children under the age of 2 were allowed to remain with their mother. Um, Guardianship of her children was automatically lodged with the guardians of the union and with the master and the matron of the workhouse, and those children were put into their various respective dormitories. And sometimes, maybe at Christmas or Easter, when they went to the chapel for religious services, they may see a relative, but not always. And that was really the only time that that family would ever get together again, unless they succeeded in leaving the workhouse and being discharged. But 9 times out of 10, if a family of 4 went in, a family of 4 never came back out again. One was always missing, and more than likely half. So it was a desperately cruel system. There's no way about it. And then just looking then at some of the numbers, composition of children in the workhouse. In England, when we look at the English poor law system, for the same years as Ireland, pauper children under the age of 16 comprised between 33% and 40% of the workhouse population. So that's quite a huge proportion. Approximately 1/3 to 40% of the workhouse admissions were all children. Now, in pre-famine Ireland, the proportion was about the same. However, by what is known as Black 47, one of the worst years of the Irish Great Hunger, it rose to 60% of all inmates in workhouses. So I'm saying workhouses, but generally it's case study based on Cork Union Workhouse. And I've looked at a few others and it's in and around the same ballpark figure. You do see a lot of the same statistics replicated. And this was 60%. However, by the latter famine years, in 1851, it continued to increase. And 63% of inmates in the Cork Union Workhouse, if not 65%, actually were within the age categories of children. So there was, you know, the famine didn't suddenly dissipate in 1850, 51. What you were left with was um, a huge amount of children who had entered with their mothers and their parents had subsequently passed away. So you had long-term orphaned children now forming long-term residency in the workhouses towards the end of the Great Hunger and right up into the mid 1850s. For them, then, assisted passage then came into play, and some of those children who would be maybe 17, 16, they were offered assisted passage to either America or to Australia. And I'm actually working on a case at the moment where we're going to do a commemoration for some of those orphan girls who left my hometown of Dunmanway and they went to Australia in 1850. Um, and largely that was to free up space in the workhouses right around Ireland. And that was known as the Earl Grey scheme of assisted passage. And some people will be familiar with Earl Grey tea, and it's the same, it's the Earl from the same family that brought us the Earl Grey tea. He was Minister for Colonies at the time, and he came up with this idea during the famine years, but it was a double-edged sword. It was number one, it helped address the gender imbalance in Australia. So even children as young, I call them children, girls as young as 14, they're still children to be shipped off to Australia, because technically the age category within the workhouse was under 15 or 16, you were classified as a child. So children were shipped to Australia as part of this, but they usually sent those girls if they had an older sister age 17 or 18 with them. So that was another element that wasn't quite nice for the orphans. And they were told that, they were going to go to Australia or America and they were going to have a much better life. But the reality for them was they were on their own in a new world. Some were only 14 and 15, and they largely entered lives of domestic servitude when they went to these countries. But it did give them, a chance at a new life. But 19th century Ireland was not a nice place to be if you were a pauper or you were one of the lower classes. So in the Cork Workhouse then, one element that I like to talk about with the children is the whole idea of schooling. And I know we were talking about this, Elizabeth, as before we came on air. And I don't know whether you could call it a little bit of a silver lining, a little bit of luck, or maybe just a little bit of a leg up in society for the children of the workhouse. So, education is possibly the one area of workhouse life that was not neglected to some extent within these workhouses. Education was seen as a deterrence to vagrancy and pauperism. It focused not only on the ordinary child inmate, but also those children with disabilities. The register described that some of the children who sought admission to the workhouse, all registers, you were obliged to give a description of the condition, the health, um, the mental capacity of the child or the adult entering the workhouse. There was a whole load of about 14 sections you had to write. Age, description, religion, whether your husband was alive, your children, whether there was a parent alive. And then you went into descriptions of whether they had a lame leg, whether they were deaf, whether they were dumb. So all of these things had to be registered. And when it came to, there was a separate section for deaf and dumb children. And deaf and dumb children then were sidelined, um, at least in the Cork Union Workhouse, and they were sent to a special school, the Cork School for Deaf and Dumb Children, and they were run by Dr. Keogh at the time. And those children, they actually got extra rations over in that school. And there was an extra amount of money sanctioned by the Board of Guardians for the Cork Deaf and Dumb School. And the minute books contain references where the guardians did award additional funding to the deaf school. And one child, I like to bring in the odd kind of, I suppose, reference and remember these children as well, because they do have names. So one child was the daughter of a girl called Julia Hunt, and this little girl was age 7, and it was decided, it was a special decision was taken that she be sent to Dr. Keogh. And I would like to think that it afforded her a better chance in society and at life. Apart from the fact that, she was segregated from her family who entered the workhouse, she was then taken to Cork School. But children did receive an education, and it did offer education to all children, even those with some disabilities. For children then who attended the regular workhouse school, they received a basic education of reading and writing. Basic attendance was obligatory at the workhouse school, and the workhouse school was actually usually quite near the dining room and the chapel. Segregation was also part of school life, so the boys were taught separately to the girls, and there was a schoolmaster for the boys and a schoolmistress for the girls. And there was also an emphasis on developing trades and skills outside of their mainstream schooling hours of reading and writing and 3 hours reading, writing, and arithmetic. So there was an emphasis on skills. The boys were educated and shown how to become apprentice carpenters, tailors, shoemakers, and weavers, and the girls served time spinning, weaving, and sewing. So they were given a trade, and one of the things that the girls did in these spinning and weaving and sewing rooms was that they actually produced a lot of the time they helped produce their own workhouse uniforms. Workhouse schools came under the remit actually of the National Board of Education, and their third report in 1846 stated that in 1846, I suppose really the first year proper of starvation in Ireland, there were 99 workhouse schools out of 130 workhouses, which was quite good in terms of if you think of that the workhouse system really only came on stream in 1840, 41 by the time they were all built. 99 of those 130s had managed to set up a schoolroom. Um, and there was about a 9 or 10 schools brought on stream every year thereafter. As famine years passed, more and more workhouse schools came on board. Staffing for the schools became an issue. The report also discusses that there was an inadequacy of giving payment to workhouse teachers, and sometimes they were paid on a voluntary basis, which meant that teaching was not really a good career option for these workhouse teachers. And a lot of people didn't want to become teachers who were teachers, did not want to teach in the workhouses. So the Board of Superintendents came up with the idea that they would award gratuities and increase payments to teachers to make teaching in the workhouse schools more advantageous. And believe it or not, it worked. And by the end of the famine, there actually was quite a large increase in the amount of workhouses that did have fully functioning schoolrooms. And I suppose the children then who did manage to leave the workhouse, they were at a distinct advantage to other people towards the end of the famine, that at least they could read and write and they could put that on a form that they could read and write. So that did help them with a little bit more of their social integration in the post-famine era. Very few children, other than those who entered the workhouse who were from the pauper class, would ever have had a chance to be educated. And one of the statistics that I discovered was that by 1853, a few years after the latter years of the Irish famine, really, 86% of children had some level of literacy that had passed through those workhouse doors. So the next 3 slides, I'm going to call them Chamber of Horrors. There'll be part 1, 2, and 3. So the first part will look at it being a chamber of horrors, which is exactly what it was. There's no two ways about it. And it was especially horrific as regards children. One commentator at the time stated, "Never ever did I visit any dungeon or any abode of crime or misery in any country which left me with the same crushing sense of sorrow and despair." And he refers largely to the horror that he saw in relation to children. That was the context behind that quote. Mortality was absolutely terrible. The odds were stacked against all inmates, and especially the elderly and the younger infant children. That age, those two age groups were particularly susceptible to disease. So as regards Cork Workhouse, mortality in the 5 years that I've put on the slide from 1845 to 1850, we've almost approximately 8,000 children in that category, up to 15 years from the existing registers, is what I calculated, had passed away in the workhouse. And some of those registers were actually missing. So there is, deaths that we'll never account for because some of the pages were missing from these record books. So from what's available, it's approximately in the region of about 8,000 children died in those 5 years. In black, 47 of those will say 7 or 8,000. In 6 months alone in Cork Workhouse, from January to June 1847, 1,400 children died. And at that stage in that year, that amounted to, when you number crunched everything, 42% of all children admissions in the infant category as well. They were experiencing the worst mortality due to fever and through disease. 42% of them were passing away, which is a horrendous, an absolutely horrendous statistic. And the next question then is like, what do they pass away from? And they were passing away from famine fever, from typhus, and that was largely early 1846 and 1847. There was a workhouse physicians. I looked in detail at a number of the workhouse physicians in the Cork Union Workhouse, and there was a O'Connor, a Dr. Popham, and a Dr. Townsend over the various years of the famine. And these three doctors were actually very, very knowledgeable. And a lot of them had a mainstream practice outside of being the physicians to the workhouse. And for those of you who would be familiar with County Cork, some of them had their medical offices on the South Mall and Marlborough Street and Cook Street, just off Patrick Street, really, in the main thoroughfares in Cork City. Each of these three doctors, I was able to find some of their personal reflections in the library of the Royal College of Surgeons in Dublin when I was doing my research. And some of them were actually sending in what today would only be termed, I suppose, as medical papers and medical scientific papers and what was happening at the time. And they sent those papers in detailing the harrowing experiences that they were seeing, and they were trying their best to come up with remedies for diseases such as cholera and typhus, because medical science as we have it today was quite different back then. So they were coming up with all sorts of remedies, and they were trying to figure out why certain diseases were spreading in the Cork Workhouse, why certain parts of that H block configuration were being affected more than others, where was it spreading from. So we have a whole load of information on these doctors and what they thought at the time. And one of the doctors remarked that in 1847 that he had 60 fever cases and 40 of them were infant children. And he couldn't understand why, out of all those cases, you're dealing with a house that there's between 2,000 and 4,000 inmates at that time, and why in one particular day it was mainly all infants. And then he discovered that some of them were newly born infants and that their umbilical tissues were far more susceptible to disease if it was in the area. And also the expectant mothers were there. And he just felt that it was just the overcrowding in certain areas. And when you take a look at the map of Cork Union Workers, you do find that things like where the supplies of milk were being delivered, they were left out and they were turning rancid. Flies and things were spreading disease. The cesspits and sanitary places were all located in an area that was quite close to the nursery wards. So you could see how disease was spreading to particularly the eastern side or the western side of the workhouse at the time. And another commentator at the time also said that when he thought of children and children's experiences at the famine, he said, for children, admission to a workhouse really was the entrance to a grave. And I suppose that's what a lot of people thought of the workhouse. And that was ingrained even in, I suppose, the Irish national psyche going forward, that when they became county homes in 1919 and the later years, I suppose, in 1870 and 1880, towards the latter years of the 19th century, that was ingrained in people's minds that whenever they had to try and even go to seek refuge in a workhouse at the time or a poorhouse, even though it was on medical grounds rather than starvation grounds towards the latter part of the 19th century, they still saw it as an entrance to the grave and felt they would never again come out. And then every so often in my research, I find that there's a little glimmer of hope, or we hear of something good. Some person has shown compassion and they're not a bureaucratic official. So the poor law bureaucrats may have been very austere, but staff often displayed human compassion. Remember, the people that worked there were just the hired help to come in to clean it, the cleaning staff, the nursing staff. Some of them were part-time workers. And there's a lovely little incident in 1846 where there's a woman called Catherine Hayes. She's a deputy nurse tender, and she was singled out in the minute books by the physicians who recognized that, she was really good at what she was doing. And they singled out what was called, in inverted commas, her humanity. And it's lovely to see these little incidents. It gives that glimmer of hope. It said that she was recommended she receive additional rations and allowances, that she receive extra gratuities, and she be appointed to a full-time role as full nurse tender. And the actual words was that she be rewarded for her humanity, care, attention, and cleanliness, which in the middle, when you're going through all this research, to see something like that in the middle of books and documents that are completely bureaucratic, it's lovely to see that element of hope and that there's that element of compassion still there, that it's just not all bad. There is hope there. And, in the midst of a crisis, that there was people that were compassionate and there was people who did care. Even if the system didn't care, the people that were in the system did care. So part two then, pediatric health. Excessive overcrowding, unsanitary conditions, and the constant waft of contagious air all imposed upon the frailty of the young children. My research into the workhouse registers indicated that one of the most common ailments that the children were afflicted by was ophthalmia, the eye disease. It was rampant. Skin conditions, inflammations, redness of the face, scurvy, digestive issues, sore limbs, and nutritional deficiencies were all commonplace with the children. They suffered from typhus fever that was endemic in every workhouse. Scurvy, as we know, is a lack of vitamin C. And then cholera, the cholera epidemic swept through most of the workhouses around 1848 to 1850, thereabouts. 1849 was particularly worse, I think, but it sort of peaked. There was peaks and troughs in it over 2 years. Their diet was so devoid of nourishment that the simplest ailment could metamorphosize into something of deadly proportions. The incubation period for many of these illnesses varied from a few days to a week, or in the case of scurvy, it could take 6 months for scurvy to turn up. So for people presenting with scurvy at the workhouse, it meant that they literally had no vitamin C for upwards of 6 months prior to admission. And the reason that there was such a prevalence of scurvy as well was largely because of the over reliance on the potato, because though potato is not a citrus fruit, and some people wonder why and how the potato could be full of vitamin C, when you look at the potato, it is a huge source of vitamin C. And the absence of the potato led to a concurrent absence of vitamin C. And over a number of time, it really just inflated the figures and the number of people who were suffering from scurvy. Weakened immune systems, the lack of vitamin C, scurvy, all contributed to this eye disease of ophthalmia, which is really excessive dryness of the eyeball. And it wasn't helped because it spread rampantly by the cramped sleeping conditions that children faced. Boys slept four in a bed in the workhouses, and that was just standard operating procedure for the time. And I don't know how many would have been in a single bed at the time when it was completely overcrowded. That number would be much higher. So the girls then were five in a bed. Close proximity was prejudicial to health, and infants under two were reliant on milk to the workhouses. And the contractors supplying milk were obviously sometimes, I suppose they didn't provide their best milk because they were guaranteed payment, and sometimes they dropped in milk that was not boiled properly, and then there was skimmed milk given to children, and milk was often contaminated, and this did not help with the spread of disease whatsoever. Typhus was endemic at the time, and as regards children, 50 to 70% of the children in Cork Workhouse who contracted typhus actually did pass away. And usually, what one of the doctors wrote was that he noted that some of the typhus patients generally had scurvy as well as a pre-existing condition before they contracted it. So it literally is your whole immune system was down. And the other thing they noticed was when it came to typhus, female teenagers tended to be more susceptible than male adolescents. So there's a lot of little nuances popping up with health of the inmate. The cholera epidemic then, that was absolutely horrendous. Children were affected due to the children were affected due to the location of the cesspits, which were at a little bit of a distance from the schoolrooms and the dormitories. They were actually spared the worst of it, I think, but it was rampant at the same time. And Dr. Popham, who was the workhouse physician at the time, graphically outlined the factors which were prejudicial to health. He wrote in one of his reports, that I discovered in the Royal College of Surgeons was that deficient in bad food, intemperate habits, neglect of personal cleanliness and hygiene, the evil effects of overcrowding were fatally evident in the workhouse. And then what did they actually eat? So I've compiled this from the records in April of 1842, which is a pre-famine. This gives you a pre-famine indication of what the diet given to children above 5 and under 13 were, and those in the age group 2 to 5. Those under 2 were given lots and lots of milk, and that was about it. And basically, what happened with the advent of the Great Hunger, that diet that you're looking at right now remained the same, with the exception that potatoes was replaced with bread, additional bread, or a stirabout or Indian meal, sort of a gruel or it's not even an oatmeal, it was more of a broth, really, and bread replaced the potatoes. But if you look at the amount of potatoes that a child between the ages of 5 and 13 consumed on a daily basis, it was 2 pounds of potatoes with half a pint of milk 4 days a week for breakfast, and 4 ounces of oatmeal and half a pint of milk the other 3 days. And then every day for dinner, they got 2.5 pounds of potatoes and bread in the evening. So 4 days a week, they were having 4 pounds of potatoes each. So you can imagine when that level of carbohydrate is removed from your diet in the workhouse and that level of vitamin C is gone, no amount of water with steeped beef heads, which was the stew or the broth in Cork Workhouse, but there was no meat given out. It was just broth, really. That was going to make sure that, whatever proper diet they were given during the hunger years, it was going to be so much worse. And it's just frightening and it's terribly sad to think what these children suffered at the time. And just cost conscious as always, that was the overriding consensus with the guardians and the poor law commissioners. Everything had to have, the figures had to add up and cost conscious policies were always there. Heads of animals were often boiled in the soup, but absolutely no meat was included in the diet. However, unlike their English and Welsh counterparts, when you look, I've looked at some of the dietary lists for the English and Welsh workhouses in Norfolk and a number of other places. The meat was given at least 4 times a week to adults and children, whereas it didn't make an entrance at all on the menu in Cork Union Workhouse at any stage in pre-famine or post-famine, and during the famine. So it's quite sad to see, but it's when you see it in front of you, the amount that reliance on potatoes that we had in the countryside and in the community, that reliance still permeated into the Poor Law Union and the workhouse diet in pre-famine and pre-hunger Ireland, which is something that's not often mentioned. And then the next slide here now, we're looking at pre-famine. Approximately 45% of child admissions to the workhouse were actually orphans. So we're looking at orphans, what happened to orphans and foundlings. Foundlings were children who were just literally abandoned and left at the workhouse. There was a hatch in the outside walls of the workhouse, and you literally took down the hatch and you put in a baby that you just wanted to be left there to be adopted or to go to an orphanage or go to a foundling hospital, and they were known as foundlings. So in 1843, just really when the workhouses were starting to take off and be built in their entirety, 45% of child inmates were orphans. That means without either foundling or without a parents. In the famine years, 60% of all children who were admitted were orphans. And in the post-famine period, there's an inaccuracy in the date, around 1851 to 55, approximately 70% of all children admitted to the workhouse were actually orphans themselves. So that just tells you that A, they were losing parents outside and they were trying to gain admission themselves. And also it tells us that sometimes mothers would just drop the children off and leave them there and hope that the children would have a better standard of life and a better chance at life. And it's quite sad to see the statistics that, 70% of children, even in the latter years, were orphans and had no parents. And also, the other thing to bear in mind is each workhouse had increased its capacity over the years of the famine. So Cork Workhouse started at a capacity of 2,000 is what it was built for. After the famine, it had up to 7,000 people, about three times its capacity. And then they had to build additional auxiliary wooden structures onto it to take all these extra admissions, including the orphans. So buildings got more and more, and the cohort of people coming in was exponentially increasing with that as well. And generally, of the 70%, I took a bit of a dive into what sort of 70%, what type of orphans were we dealing with this 70% figure. And it's about 68% was actual orphans and 2% were foundlings just towards the end of the An Gorta Mór. And then this is just giving you a little overview of Cork Workhouse. So this is the front building that I showed you again at the start, except it's been, what would we say, refurbished in recent years. It had capacity for 2,000. Dunmanway Workhouse, my local one, had capacity for 4,000. And then there's a workhouse that was, or 400. There's Offaly Workhouse, and Portumna is often given as an example in some books, that had a capacity for 800, but all the design features tended to be the same. And life within the workhouse was strictly regimented, strict routines, a strict timetable. And then, so we're on slide 18. So there was also a number of real life experiences about some of the children, and just to kind of put sort of a name to some of them and to remember them while we're talking about their age group in the workhouse. There was one little guy called William Holland, aged 14. In 1851, he was discovered as an orphan outside the workhouse doors, and he was brought in and admitted into the workhouse. So he went up and sought admission to the workhouse, and they discovered that he already was wearing the workhouse uniform, but the pants was a little short and the sleeves had gone up. So to me, that indicates that that little guy, William, had obviously been inside in the workhouse at some stage and had obviously left perhaps with an older sibling or with a parent. And here he was now, aged 14, 1851, still wearing that uniform from a previous admission, seeking readmission. And there also was the case of a couple of children from a couple of girls, sisters from Carricknavar outside Cork City, of the surname Callahan, who were admitted in the early years of 1841. And when I searched the register and totted up the ages and the differences, these girls, again, were admitted in 1848. Some of them were now 12, 13, 14 years old. They were admitted again, but this time there was a note on their register saying admitted with no friends or family, suggesting that they've lost their family. So it's the small details that are on the registers that really allow us to kind of dig into, the personal face of the workhouse. And I'm all about, in my research, giving a face to the orphans, giving a face to the victims, and actually remembering the experiences of individuals inside in these workhouse institutions. We tend to read books on the Irish famine, and it's about the famine. It's about the politics of the famine. It's about the Corn laws and all things like that that did go on. But for me, the actual experience of the individual and what the individual experienced, especially in workhouse institutions, and trying to put names and faces to these huge numbers is what I enjoy is probably the wrong word, but it's my area of research and my personal favorite area. And looking at inmate health and welfare and children is something I think that's nice to do, and it's nice to remember them because we tend to remember the famine. So going forward, I'd like to say if you ever can get your hands on anything to do with the workhouse, it's just nice to remember the other victims who sometimes have just been nameless but have been a number. Um, so I'm just going to quickly run through the next two or three slides. They're just pictures to give you an overview of this is Dunmanway Union Workhouse, which is literally 2 miles down the road from where I live. And you can see again the H block presentation. You can see at the top of your screen it says Fever Hospital. These would be wooden huts where they would isolate people um, who were suffering from contagious diseases to take them off the main site and just put them over to the Fever Hospital and move them over and back as they got well. Um, as regards to Manway, if you can look, there's a little square dot towards the middle there where it says the word union. If you can see that, that actually is where the cesspits were located. And what you'll find is the dormitories closest to those cesspits were the ones worst afflicted with disease. When you start figuring out east and west and north and south, and they sometimes the guardians will say the western part of the building was worst affected or the southern part. And if you can find a plan for your workhouse and you find out where the sanitary facilities were and the cesspits and the cesspools were, you'll probably find your source of infection there. And then this is just an image of a doorway. Most of the doorways inside in the workhouses tended to have been arched doorways. And this is a doorway, a roomed doorway. Obviously, you can just see the ivy has taken over, but most of them were left. You can see the way they were unfinished, unplastered. There's no remnants of plaster left at all in this workhouse. It was very basic, and it gives you an idea. All internal doors as well tended to have arched doorways. And then this is an extract for the suppawn, the porridge, the Indian meal, how they prepared it. And I would just draw your attention to the top line, um, where it says Indian meal to be used as human food. It kind of you that tells you really, an awful lot when you look at it, how to be used for human food. And what the doctors also noted in their reports years later was that the early batch of Indian meal, there was no instructions with it on how to cook it, how to boil it, the duration that you needed to boil it for. And when you gave that to sick children and malnourished individuals, when they did some autopsies on the bodies at the time, because some people were not sick enough to have died from it, they wondered why they died from Indian meal. And what they found was that the Indian meal kernels had actually punctured their bowels and intestines. And for some people, even the young children, that diet of the early Indian meal, which was an inferior type of Indian meal and harder to digest, in its own right contributed and caused probably more diseases than the initial starvation. So we see different things popping up in the course of my research, and when you look at some of the reports and you piece it all together. So it's that was another interesting find. Concluding thoughts. Um, I'd like to, as I say, remember the famine victims, put some names on some of those people, remember them, and remember as well that, people did show compassion during the Great Hunger. And remember also that the bureaucrats, on the other hand, were unwavering and they were guided by their principles of workhouse organisation, um, much the same as bureaucracies today. There's just an overriding view that, you have policies to attain, and that's that. And that but they were exceptionally unwavering as well at the time. Um, I often wonder what the impact on children was long term. Their psychological impact must have been immense. And remember, workhouses were never intended to deal with the famine, the hunger. They were never asked to deal with the mass starvation event. They were just a bureaucratic institution set up first day to deter vagrancy, but they had to do the best with what they had. And there was no way they were getting additional funding to provide additional food. That was just not an option at the time. So, did they actually help? So, it's yes, a little bit, maybe. They're the words that best describe it. Some staff, I would say, try their best. There is incidences where masters and matrons have resigned from a workhouse because they could no longer deal with what they were seeing and what was being presented to them on a daily basis, and their level of compassion comes through. Um, but the commissioners and the people at the top, their hands were completely constrained by policy. So I would like to think that on balance, yes, they tried to help in a way as best they could with whatever compassion they could. But, sometimes it didn't all play well. And then this year, just remember, I think it's the 180th anniversary of 1845. So the coming autumn in 2025 is the 180th anniversary. Um, and I think that probably we need to kind of revise and kind of come back and revisit the famine a little bit more. And for anybody wanting to know more, as Elizabeth said, my book Famine in Cork City, it's available online through Mercier Press, through Amazon. And if you can get your hands on a copy of the Atlas of the Great Famine, that's an amazing tome of work altogether, and it shows many different things. So thank you for your
That
time
was
today.
great. Thank you so much, Michelle. Very sad, of course, and kind of heartbreaking. I think the thing that strikes me over and over again about these stories about the Great Hunger is how anonymous it is, for those in the workhouse or receiving the indoor or outdoor relief. I gave a talk maybe at the start of this month about my own hometown, Listowel, and as you said, like Dunmanway kind of is famous, or like Skibbereen, these big famous stories that we know from the time, because of the eyewitnesses, but my hometowns, I think originally was supposed to be able to take 800, and within 5 or 6 months there was 1,200, and then they were renting sheds and doing all kinds of things. And we only know the name of 3 people buried in the mass grave, so it's absolutely shocking and very difficult. And as I said that night, my probably great grandfather was on the board of guardians. They owned a few stores in the town, and he was on the board of guardians that met every week to discuss, how many were dying and how many were coming in and out, and complaining about farmers delivering sour milk and all of these things. So thank you so much for doing it. We've had a couple of questions. Some you kind of did manage to answer, and I hope that you guys can see at the bottom of your screen either the chat or the Q&A feature. Kathleen was wondering, is there a searchable database of people entered into the Cork workhouses? I'd say the short answer is kind of no, because
No.
records were spotty at the best of times. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. All you get is just a list of registers with names, and some details, but they're very fragmentary. They're not extensive. You're not going to get a full list anywhere. Um, so you'd have to just trawl through them.
Yeah. And I think
Do the
Michelle too,
legwork.
like Listowel's ones, were housed in Tralee. I know 1847, funnily enough, was missing. But I don't think that it's not like they followed up on the patients, so they might record Elizabeth Stack going in, but
Hmm.
you're just numbers, like it was a column of how many died. So they kind of don't seem to tally who's dead and who's moved in and who's moved out, really, so yeah, it's a kind of a difficult one. Kathleen says thanks.
I
Um,
think the easiest way to try and get the tally is when you can try and get your hands around the discharge figures. You kind of
yeah.
have to try and figure it out, and you have to take it over proportions over a month and try and
Yeah.
figure out how many did come in during the month and how many went out.
Yeah. Well, and so, but Michelle, you still wouldn't have had names, would you? It
No,
would just be the
no.
numbers. Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
there was in some workhouses there is a register of people who did leave.
Oh, good. Okay.
There's
Those
like
names are
there
recorded.
is a discharge register,
Okay.
But it's very hard to get your hands on them. The most
Yeah.
that you'll get from most workhouses would be the minute books and
Okay.
the indoor register when they actually come in first day.
Yeah.
If you had a list of people now, for example, orphans that were going to be sent off on assisted passage schemes, you
Yeah.
might be lucky enough that would come to a resolution for the Board of Guardians, and those
Yeah.
names would actually be cited. You know, the 10 or 12 girls might their name might be on
Yeah.
the list.
We had that in Listowel actually. Yeah, it records their name and their address. And I think like one of them I know was a Mulvihill girl. I think it said that her mom had died. You know, there was a little bit of
You do,
external
yeah,
kind of information. Yeah,
exactly.
but mostly just names and address, names and ages. Um, okay, so you did talk about this. I think what is the admission criteria, the age range of kids, and what conditions, no parents or poverty line. So that came up, that sometimes it
Yeah,
was obvious the family had died. Was intake done in English or in Irish or both?
English,
Yeah. We see
English.
this is it. A lot of people think that, the Irish, it really wasn't. I mean, it depended on where you were in the country, but, we were speaking English in
We
1845.
we we were
Yeah.
speaking English, and these books were modelled on the English poor law system. So there was a stationery place in Dublin,
Yeah.
a company who mass produced these books. And remember, you are talking about the English bureaucratic system in Ireland, so they would not be doing anything in
Yeah.
Irish whatsoever.
Right. Yeah. And like maybe the people recording it might have had the Gaeilge, but, they would have had to answer in English. Yeah.
Yeah, they
Yeah.
would have had to answer in English, and because of the nature of the building, and the institution itself, you could speak Irish inside
Mm.
there,
Hmm.
but the bureaucrats and the clerical officers, they would have got into trouble if they were writing it down in Irish as well. You
Yeah.
know, the whole thing would be to promote the English language and promote
Yeah.
English bureaucratic principles and send people abroad fluent in English, you know.
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
don't think it's probably one thing that never really came up or was discussed in any of the minute books was the teaching of Irish. I don't think that would ever have been allowed whatsoever.
Yeah. Which I'd say even under the National School
Not
Act of
not
the
under
1830s, they were teaching them English
under
anyway.
that National School Act, no, because
Yeah.
that was like in the 13th report of the commissioners, that was all English, and it
Yeah.
tended to be English and maths and skill bases,
Hmm.
skill based and music and things like that. You know,
Which again
Irish was
stood to
not at the
them.
forefront of anything.
No. Yeah, but you see,
Well,
it's such a
yeah,
complicated thing because this helps Irish immigrants in certainly in cities like New York, when you compare us to like later
it
on the
does.
Italians or the
Yeah.
Germans and the Jews, we spoke English. So like we were politicized earlier and, able to take on jobs. They were already, of course, discriminated against because of their Catholicism and stuff, but the fact that we were English speaking was a massive leg up for us as immigrants.
I think it was, so like as I said, when we look at the workhouse school, children who attended the workhouse school had that distinct advantage over the people
Kids in
who
the
were outside
village.
and the
Yeah.
paupers outside. So they had that advantage that wherever they ended up, if they survived the
Yeah.
Great Hunger and they left the workhouse, they had that advantage of being able to read and write and add,
Yeah.
and for any lady looking for a domestic servant,
Hmm.
if your servant could read or write, that meant instant promotion to a different sort of personal correspondent, or that was another leg up again in society.
Yeah.
So, and then when they went to Australia, the same thing again.
Yeah.
So it's a bit of a double-edged sword, a horrible existence, but schooling was probably the one silver lining that I could see that would help them socially later on.
Hmm. Those just
Have
to
you any more questions?
there's one or two when you were giving the insight into their life. I was saying in my talk a couple of weeks ago that I had come across the matron had written in her notes in the Guardian minute book that she'd had to discipline a young boy. He was about 5 or 6 and he'd run from the boys' dormitory across into the girls' dormitory again, she noted, to sleep with his
Yeah,
sister, and she'd had to
yeah.
punish him. So they had a terrible life. So I
And
heard Kathleen says that the Dunmanway workhouse was supposedly not as bad as some others. Is there truth to that? And if it wasn't as bad, what did Dunmanway do well?
um, there, okay, so Kathleen, there was a report went out, and I think I had to quieten that. It went out on Facebook group a number of months ago that said Dunmanway Workhouse was not as bad, and we fared pretty well. Well, I'm here to tell you that it was designed for 400 and it had 800 and it had a gravel pit that went down through the farmers' yards and the fields behind the workhouse, down to the local graveyard known as Fanlubbis. And initial estimates from the five sunken pits, but possibly seven there, suggest upwards of between 300 and 600 undocumented bodies. So if you're thinking 400 is capacity, 800 in around 1847, 48, or even 600, it's still within the parameters that's experienced with the worst workhouses experienced around the country. So it's in proportion to the numbers that, for example, if Cork was doubling and if Listowel was doubling twice their capacity and Skibbereen was, you know, I know what she's referring to. And that was in accuracy. There was a report went out, and it was somebody gave her a reflection in the 1900s. And when I dug into it, part of that reflection came from a wealthy landlord's wife who didn't want to say that it was particularly bad. So the experience of Dunmanway is it was bad,
Yeah.
and there is references of coffins being taken with three and four bodies in one coffin to the famine pits outside Dunmanway. Um, so yes, the when we're talking at that period and a workhouse, there is no good workhouse, and there's no place in Ireland was left unscathed. And if you're talking, a lot of it is proportionality, and you are talking West Cork and Kerry, and we did suffer greatly down here as well. So yeah, so no, I would hit that one on the head pretty quickly.
Well, and that's it, like the overcrowding alone, not to mind the hunger, but the diseases just spread so
Yeah,
rampantly
yeah.
because you're, lying in these dorms. James wanted to know if the recording would be available. So it will, James. We put it up on our YouTube channel. It's the American Irish Historical Society's YouTube channel, and it'll be on our website. And then, like Michelle will be able to link to it. I'll also put it on our Facebook page. Um, and then Margaret said, thank you so much. Very good talk, illuminating and enlightening. And then Kathleen said, oh my, thank you for clarifying. Yeah, like, look, it's a terrible time, and I mean, of course, there's no aspersions being cast on anybody, but as we were saying when we were off camera at the start, there's a long chain of people involved in these, farmers delivering food. In Listowel, at one point, they were complaining about the fact that the girls in the workhouse were sewing because it was taking work away from, girls that were outside of the workhouse that were sewing, so there's a
Yeah,
lot of dynamics and there's a lot of middlemen and agents and this, as you say, the heartless bureaucracy kind of over all of it. But then there were amazing nuns and priests and doctors who ministered and who also got sick and died, and sometimes the poor law commissioners who came in to interview them, to try to
yeah,
raise awareness of the horrible standards. I know Listowel, as you said yourself, built for 2/3 of the budget, sometimes built very quickly, so with shoddy kind of materials. The
yeah.
Listowel workhouse was flooded, before it even opened, kind of a thing. So terrible conditions, and that memory lived long, into the 20th century. So thank you so much, Michelle. I know it's getting late at home. I just want to say we're back next week live. If any of you are here on April 3rd for Emerald Strings, it's an immersive concert that we're doing in conjunction with the Irish Rep Theatre, although actually I think tickets for that are sold out. Then we have a play on the 4th and 5th with Origins Theatre Festival, Shelter. It's a great hunger play written by John Doyle. April 7th live, we have that Emerald Strings concert. And on the 8th, we're back in with Jane Oldmeyer from Trinity University talking about making empire, Ireland imperialism, and the kind of early British Empire. So lots going on. We'll have a couple of talks online later on in the month. So keep an eye, but there's plenty for you to catch up on our YouTube channel because we did do several Great Hunger lectures that were online, so you can catch those. So thank you, Michelle, so much, and do everyone check
No,
out our
thank you.
website
And
and
thanks
Facebook.
everyone for listening and for contributing their questions.
Absolutely, yeah. It's
And
always great to have the community in. So thanks and enjoy the last few days of March. Take care, everyone. Good night.
you too. Good night. Thank you. Bye bye.